Okay, so looking at those characteristics of autism, again, we have those 4 areas, right? And 2 of them are associated features. So the first one is the disturbance of the communication process. Remember, disturbance is that unevenness, but kids have difficulty with the communication process. So it can be a number of things. It can be difficulty with comprehension. I shared that example already. Difficulty with social awareness, how other people are interacting or how their behavior affects others. Sometimes the language production can be difficult, and difficulty in comprehension of reading and language. So if we talk about the difficulty with comprehension, it can not only be spoken language, like what someone is saying to the child or what that child is saying to you, but also things like gestures and body posture. People that are doing different things. We're going to talk about this in a minute on theory of mind, where like someone looking at their watch can kind of be giving this social cue that I want to be finished with this conversation right now. Or facial expressions for kids that, don't recognize when someone has a facial expression of like, what are you talking about? People recognize that in a conversation, and they sometimes adjust the conversation. They can read that and say, oh, I can tell this person isn't understanding what I'm saying. Maybe I'll back up. Maybe I'll ask a question, and we do what we call repairing language. Our kids oftentimes miss those pieces. There's also a challenge with understanding strategies for understanding the communication process, and sometimes they have difficulty initiating social contact. And this involves this lack of awareness of the need to direct something to a person, that language is social, that there's a communicative piece that's social. So as an example, I had one of my students, Sam, and we were working on going on a community trip to order at McDonald's. I wanted him to be able to successfully, go up to the counter and order independently, pay. So they were all some of the goals that we were working on. And we role played this in the classroom, and he was doing great. Like I would stand, I would say, okay, may I take your order? And he had it down memorized. He was, he's like, I want a cheeseburger, French fries, and a Diet Coke. And so we'd practice, and I'd say, great job. And we'd practice, exchanging money and all that kind of stuff. I thought he was ready. I was like, he's got it. He's going to be able to order independently. I was really excited. So we go to McDonald's on a particular day for lunch, and he's all prepared, I thought, and he goes up to the counter, and she says, hi, can I take your order? And he says, he kind of looks down. I think he was kind of nervous about actually being in the setting, but he's like, I want a cheeseburger, French fries, and a Diet Coke, and then turned around and walked away. And part of that was the fact that he sat down hoping that his food would show up, and that was not going to happen. So in other words, he didn't get, he said, I said the words, the food should show up. He didn't understand the communication piece. You need to be able to say, does that person understand what I'm saying? Do they have questions? Do they need clarifications? It was like, I want a cheeseburger, French fries, and Diet Coke. I go sit down, that food is going to show up. Not recognizing that message needs to be directed to a person in order for kids to really be able to communicate and for people to understand what we're communicating. Sometimes kids tend to have a standoffish manner where they don't seem to be very socially aware. They have difficulty responding to others, and then eye contact is always a big thing that people talk about. So some kids have a hard time making eye contact. Some don't recognize the importance of eye contact. If you read about Temple Grandin's work, she talks about how she's a very visual learner. So sometimes having to listen to someone talk, which is harder for her to comprehend, and watch and make eye contact all at the same time, can be very difficult for her. But another example, I was able to listen to a lot of training by Tony Atwood. He works a lot with kids with Asperger's syndrome. If you ever get a chance to take some of his training, it's very good. But in one of the trainings, he was giving this example where he was talking to an adolescent that had Asperger's syndrome, and the whole time the kid was looking at the floor. So they're having this back and forth conversation while the kid with Asperger's syndrome is looking at the floor. And Tony Atwood stops and he says, do you know how difficult it is for me to have this conversation with you when you're not looking at me? And the kid said, why do I need to look at you when I know where you are? And so not recognizing that social interaction involves good eye contact. Now, people always ask me, do you force eye contact? I would say for sure you have to teach kids that when they're communicating with someone, they're communicating by being in the right direction. I'll have kids that are talking to someone and they're completely turned around. But eye contact is difficult for a lot of people. Everybody has their own comfort level. So do I want someone like staring into someone's eyes? Not necessarily, but we definitely want to have kids like, face the partner that they're trying to communicate with, look at their face and kind of interact in that way. Other things that have to do with this area have to do with like the rules of proximity, how close that you get to somebody. I have people that are kids that like are way too close and they're talking to someone. And so kind of teaching kids that an arm's distance is a good way to kind of understand what that proximity should look like when you're communicating with someone. How to ask or join a conversation or play. Taking turns and waiting can be hard. Think about how much time we have to wait. We wait for a doctor's appointment. We wait in line at the grocery store. We wait for the bus to come. Kids with autism sometimes have difficulty with waiting, and so that's a lot of areas that can cause some problem behavior. Also, taking someone else's perspective. Had this little guy I was talking to. He's talking to me about all this stuff with Pokemon. My kids were never into that, so I had no idea what he was talking about. So I started asking some questions because I was kind of interested. Well, he figured that everybody's perspective was the same as his, in that everybody knew what he knew about Pokemon. So he just got frustrated and walked away. He's like, oh, I hate talking to people that act like they don't understand. I was like, no, I really don't understand. But he had trouble with that because his perspective was different. Also, something called theory of mind. This is a very interesting component to me because this can sometimes differentiate autism from other developmental disabilities. So the definition of theory of mind has to do with mind reading, or the ability to infer others' plans, thoughts, points of views, or emotional conditions. Now, this is not indicative of intelligence. Kids can struggle with theory of mind and still have an average to above average IQ. But theory of mind, again, has to do with mind reading, and I kind of gave this example earlier. If I'm talking to someone and that person looks at their watch, I'm going to think what they're thinking is that they need to be somewhere and they probably need to wrap up this conversation, or maybe they're trying to give me a social cue that I'm boring and I need to stop talking. Whatever, they're not saying anything out loud. They just had looked at their watch, and that makes me think what they're thinking. I can read their mind. Now, this is something that's an important component in social interaction, but I was able to watch this video that was part of a workshop that I went to, and I'll just kind of explain it because it had some really important components that help, which first of all is that theory of mind begins to develop at 24 months. So as soon as someone's 2, they start to recognize theory of mind. So the way that they had this video set up is that they had, first was a little girl who was sitting on the floor playing. So she was just sitting there playing with toys. And then mom and a teacher were kind of over here sitting on 2 chairs. And so somebody comes into the room, sets down this toy, it was like this little robot toy, and turns it on. So now this robot toy is coming towards the little girl. Now the parent and the therapist, their only instruction was that they were supposed to act as if they were afraid of it, but they couldn't use words, right? So they're like, oh, and pointing to it and that kind of thing. So you can see this little girl, she's 2 years old, starts to understand theory of mind. She looks at the robot, she looks at mom, she looks at the robot, she goes and gets up in mom's lap and starts crying. So mom never said, this is a scary thing, come here, but she could read mom's body language and the behaviors that she was showing and knew that there was something scary about that. The second clip, which is why I thought this was so interesting, is they did this with a child with Down syndrome. So a kid with Down syndrome that's also 2 years old, he's on the floor playing with toys, mom and the therapist are over here. They have the robot toy come in, it's kind of coming towards the little boy, maybe a little slower, but he was looking at the toy, he was looking at mom, and this was the cute part. He gets up and he goes and he kicks the toy. So he was gonna save mom from this scary thing. But it's interesting because at 2 years old, he still has a developmental disability, he has Down syndrome, but he's understanding theory of mind. What do we know about kids with Down syndrome? They're very social, still oftentimes very loving. Granted, stubborn at times, but we love them anyway, but very, very social. That's because that's a piece that you need for social interaction, is to recognize how other people are thinking and feeling without them saying it, reading their body language. The third clip was a little boy that was 2 years old that had just been diagnosed with autism. You could see that he was on the floor and he was kind of doing some stemming behaviors, or that self-stimulatory behaviors, where he was kind of rocking and kind of like playing with some little toy over and over. And this robot toy comes in and it comes towards the child. mom and the therapist are acting as if they're afraid. They're like, oh, all this kind of stuff. And this little boy never looked up. He never looked up at the robot. He never looked up at mom. He kind of stayed in his own world. So it was clear that he was not developing theory of mind at that age. And again, that tends to kind of differentiate autism from some of the other developmental disabilities, because that's an area that kids sometimes struggle with. Now, there's also higher levels of theory of mind. So sometimes our kids, at some point start to begin to recognize some of these things. But a higher level of theory of mind is to be able to lie, right? And so we don't think about the fact that we want to teach kids to lie, but we do kind of teach our kids sometimes to maybe not say everything out loud that they're thinking in order to make sure that you don't hurt someone's feelings. So like, let's say, for example, your 3-year-old, you have to go to Aunt Margaret's for Christmas, and you have your little boy who's 3. Aunt Margaret knits pink bunny slippers for him for Christmas. And, he opens up the gift and he's like, ooh, those are for girls. I'm not wearing those, and completely embarrasses you in front of Aunt Margaret. Later, when the child becomes a little bit older, you can say on the way there, hey, if Aunt Margaret knits you pink bunny slippers, just smile and say thanks, and then you can tell me in the car that you don't like them. So that ability to be tactful and polite to not hurt someone's feelings. Well, how many kids of our Asperger's syndrome just say what they think? They're not able to recognize why they shouldn't say certain things. This is my favorite example of this. I had a student, Tim, and he also, besides Asperger's syndrome, had obsessive compulsive disorder, and he would perseverate, which means that you talk about things over and over again. And one week it was toilet paper. I don't know why. He was interested in toilet paper. He talked to every faculty member. Where do you buy your toilet paper? What brand do you use? How much does it cost? And literally at the end of the week, he could have made an Excel spreadsheet that told everybody their toilet paper preferences. For whatever reason, that's what he was interested in. That one kind of stopped. Then he starts this new one where he was interested in bald men. I don't know why, but he found that fascinating and interesting. And so he was, at the time, that's kind of one of the things he was obsessing about. We were out in the community, and I don't know what we were doing, some kind of field trip or something. And we see a guy that's bald, an older man that was bald. And so Tim goes, Mrs. Bowie, there's a baldy. And I was like, oh my gosh. I said, Tim, you can't say that. And he's like, why? Doesn't he know? Well, obviously he knows, but not recognizing why you shouldn't say that. And so they miss those components of theory of mind. And that's where a lot of times kids with Asperger's syndrome don't know how to lie, because they say exactly what they're thinking, even if that could possibly be offensive to someone. We also have something called the Sally Ann test, and this is a false belief test that's used to assess theory of mind, and that is what someone else is thinking. So there's different ways of doing the test. I also saw another little study that they did, and it was presented on Dateline or something like that many years ago. But basically, if you can imagine, there was a child with autism sitting at a table, and a neurotypical child, a child without autism. So they're both sitting here. And the therapist has 2 cups on the table. One is blue and one is red. And both the children with autism and without see her put a ball under the blue cup. Okay, so they're both saying, where's the ball? They both answer correctly, it's under the blue cup. They have the child without autism, the neurotypical peer, leave the classroom. Okay. Then the therapist moves the ball under the red cup. And then they have the child without autism, the neurotypical peer, come back in. And the question to the child with autism is, where does he think, the typical peer, think the ball is? Now, unless you thought someone was playing a trick on you, the answer should be under the blue cup, right? He didn't see anything change. As far as he knows, it's still under the blue cup. But many, many kids with autism said it was under the red cup, that he would know it was under the red cup, even though he didn't see that perspective. And so this is something that also helps us to kind of test and evaluate theory of mind. These deficits can lead to a difficulty in understanding the perspective of others, difficulty explaining their behavior and understanding emotions, and lack the understanding of how their behavior impacts others and make other people feel. So other cognitive deficits that kind of go within this area have to do with assigning meaning, sometimes that perspective taking, but generalization can also be an area that's very difficult for kids. You may have kids that they learn something one way, but then in another way they can't demonstrate it. And kids with very significant difficulty with generalization, you could show them the picture of a cat on a blue rug, and you're working on the picture, what is this? It's a cat. And they finally identified that it's a cat, but if you show a cat sitting on a couch, they can't identify it because they're not generalizing. I always tell people when you're working with kids, that money that comes with the math sets that are plastic, I usually tell people, don't bother teaching kids with autism with that money, because some that don't generalize are going to learn that a quarter is a quarter, but it's a plastic quarter, and then you try to get them to pick out the real quarter, and they can't do that. Another example, I had this little girl in kindergarten, and we were trying to teach her various directions that we might see in a classroom. And one of them was like, go sit down, get your book out to page 4, go through this way. So she was responding to all of these things, making really good progress on these goals. And we were ready for her to go to kindergarten. We thought, first grade. And so we really thought like she was ready to really be integrated in this classroom. So she goes into first grade, and the kids are hanging up their backpacks and stuff. And she's just kind of standing there. And the teacher all of a sudden says, okay, everybody, let's take a seat. And she had no idea what to do because I didn't teach her take a seat. I taught her go sit down. So she didn't generalize it well enough to use it in another way, in another environment. Another example with generalization, I had this little girl in middle school, and she would not use the bathroom at the middle school, and she would not use the bathroom when we went out on a community trip. Mom's like, I don't get it. She uses it at home. She doesn't have any problem at home, but she was like holding it all day. And it got to the point where she was getting a bladder infection from holding it all day, and we was like, wow, we need to figure this out, but we couldn't. She seemed scared, she wouldn't go in, she was refusing. You can't make somebody go to the bathroom. Well, our building, this middle school building, was also part of an elementary building. It was like all one big building, but we never went over to the elementary side, except this particular week where it rained like all week, and my kids were kind of stir crazy. We hadn't been able to go outside. I'm like, let's just go for a walk. So we kind of walked the building to go over to the elementary side just to make the walk a little bit longer. And we're walking, and so we'd never been over there. There's the nurse's office in that part of the building, and inside the nurse's office is a bathroom, and the door was open. We go by, Heather immediately sees that bathroom, goes in and uses the bathroom. I'm like, that is so weird, because she won't use it at school, but she used that toilet, but not in public and not in the middle school. Finally figured this out. I don't know, it was just like kind of a guess or whatever, because I was really trying to kind of evaluate the difference. Most of the time, and this is how it was in middle school and also in public toilets, the toilet seat is more like a horseshoe. There's a space, it doesn't connect the whole way, whereas most of the time the toilet seats in your home are one solid circle. And so for her, she couldn't generalize to use a different toilet, and the toilet that was in that nurse's office was a toilet like you have in your home. And so we realized that she needed to relearn how to use that kind of a toilet. It was scary to her, but it took us a long time to figure out that it was just the difference in the toilet seat that made it difficult for her. They might also have trouble with organization, rigidity, and a lack of flexibility. Also some language production problems, so lack of gestures and facial expressions. Again, with that echolalic speech that we've talked about a little bit, so not being able to understand exactly what you're saying, but rather just repeating. Do you want a cookie or a cracker? They say cracker. You want a cracker or a cookie? They say cookie. Now, sometimes I can use that to teach language. If they have some echolalic language, I can say, do you want a cracker? Your language is yes. And then they repeat the last thing, yes. I can reinforce that. And so that's something that you can sometimes do if kids have echolalic language, but you have to recognize that that can sometimes be going on. I've had kids, and it can be delayed. Like I had a kid that would come in, and anytime he saw a thermostat, he's like, don't touch the thermostat, keep your hands to yourself. Well, he probably started hearing that when he was 3 years old and finally tall enough to touch it. And so that was something that he would repeat that was delayed, and sometimes it's right away. Do you want a hot dog? Hot dog. And they say it right away. Sometimes their echolalic language is actually a way to kind of like tune out what's going on. Like they go into some of the echolalic language of the movies that they watch. I know a lot of kids that can recite different parts of movies and different things like that. Sometimes it's actually an attempt to have communication. So I'll have kids that pick things out of a movie that's their way of trying to communicate when they can't come up with better language. So know that that echolalic language is part of autism, but also recognize that it can interfere with their ability to actually functionally communicate. And so I told you where the child, Chris, wanted the hot dog or hamburger, and he said hamburger but really wanted hot dog. The way that we were able to change that was when he went through the line, we said, which one do you want? And he can point to it instead of saying the last thing that he heard, and that was very helpful. Another one can be verbal perseverations, where kids talk about the same things over and over, maybe this unusual rate or voice quality fluency, and sometimes these unconventional, non-acceptable ways of dealing with behavior and communicating messages. So instead of using language, kids remove themselves. They might hit, they might use different kinds of ways to communicate because they don't have the language to do so. And then deficits in assigning meaning. Again, this is all in that same category of a disturbance of communication and language and the cognitive process, is that sometimes kids have trouble with cause and effect and object permanence, that something still exists when you can't see it. Symbolic representation, that a United States flag represents freedom, that's very difficult sometimes for kids. And sometimes attention to detail, where they over-focus. So this is one of my favorite stories. This was actually in somebody that presented as a training. So it was a man with autism. I don't know, he's in his 30s, and his job was to clean this family's house. Like, I don't know how he got the job. This family basically had him come once a week to clean their house while they were at work. And the guy was great at it because he liked everything to be in its place. So it was a very good, repetitive job for him, and he did very well. Well, I guess he'd been doing this for them for several years. They kind of knew this individual through a family friend or something. And one day they left a message on the kitchen counter before they left for work, and they said something like, "Hey Joe, thanks so much for cleaning. You always do a great job. Hey, notice anything new?" Well, they had gotten a new couch over the weekend. They come back from work, and there was 3 loose leaf pieces of paper that had like 125 things that were new. So he said the red toothbrush was on the left side of the sink instead of the right side of the sink, and the pillow was on the floor instead of the bed. So every tiny little detail that he recognized as being different from the last time he was there, he said was new, and it was like number 67, new couch. No different than any of these other things. So, here I'm thinking he's got to clean the house, and he's like, well, I guess I got to sit down and write this list. But the idea is he would over-focus and not necessarily recognize what's the most important thing, or being over-focused on details. And that's something that you can see. I had this other kid who was using these pictures of various things in the community to try to teach him things about the community. And one of them was a hospital room. So there was the bed, there was a tray, it had a stethoscope on it, a little cup of medicine. So the idea is like, where is this, Chris? And he should say hospital. Only he looked at it for the first time and he said telephone. I was like, why did he say telephone? Well, you could see on the other side of the hospital bed, this is back in the days when telephones still had cords, the only thing you could see hanging off of the nightstand over on the side of the bed was the cord of the telephone. So he looks at it, focuses on that, and says telephone, not looking at the big picture. Also, difficulty with comprehension. So this is an important piece. Children with autism tend to have their ability to comprehend language overestimated more than any other group of language impaired children, and that's by Barry Prezant. I think it's very important we overestimate their ability to understand language. Sometimes kids may seem to be understanding language. Like if you're in the bathroom and you say, "Here, brush your teeth," and you hand someone a toothbrush, they're probably going to brush their teeth. But would they understand it if you said, "Okay, I want you to go get the red toothbrush out of the bathroom and bring it in and put it on the dining room table"? They might not understand that. And I think a lot of times people think that it has to do with intelligence. This kid that I worked with, Sam, was like really, really smart, above grade level in a lot of areas, but he wasn't understanding everything. And I was trying to tell the staff, like, I don't think he's understanding everything that you're saying. "Oh no, he's smart. You don't know him as well as we do. He's smart." I'm like, no, I'm not saying he's not smart. I'm saying he's not understanding language because of hearing it is not his way of comprehending. So I said, "Sam, what'd you have for dinner last night?" He didn't respond. I said, "Did you have chicken nuggets?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Did you have macaroni and cheese?" "Yes." "Did you have chocolate milk?" "Yes." I said, "Did you have worms?" "Yes." I said, see, he's just answering because that's what he normally does and says, and he may not be comprehending any of it. That's why it's so important to make everything visual, which is again why I'll refer you back to the other webinar and visual strategies, so we can put these things in place to try to help increase comprehension. Here's a list of various things that we can see with communication. So various ways that kids can comprehend, or not comprehend, but communicate in a way that's not always the best way to communicate if they're missing words. So we have crying and tantrums and grabbing or reaching or self-removal, pointing, gesturing, all of those kinds of things. It's a good idea to recognize those things so that we can then teach kids how to appropriately communicate. Last piece on this component, on understanding the communication part, is there are aspects of communication skills of verbal individuals. So for those higher functioning individuals that are verbal, what does that look like? Sometimes they use irrelevant details that, they're talking about something that isn't really related to the subject. And again, this perseveration on specific topics. They may get really stuck on wanting to talk about the weather or Thomas the Trains, or again, my student that really liked Volkswagen Beetles. Sometimes there's an inappropriate shift to a new topic, like you're talking about something and they shift to another topic without any warning. Ignoring some initiations, lack of strategy to repair the conversation. Again, when someone looks at you like, what? I don't get what you're saying, to repair that conversation. And then again, problems with perspective taking, seeing what other people would be seeing from their perspective. That oftentimes can be very difficult for kids. Some misperceptions in autism is that every word has a single meaning and a rule only applies to a single situation or the same way forever. That's oftentimes what kids with autism, they'll think that everybody believes the same thing that I do. If there's a group, the person is always talking to me. In the group, the speaker is not talking to me. If someone says it, it has to be true. And I should do exactly what I'm told in exactly the same way. These are my kids I love these kids. They're like the autism police, right? Every rule, they want to follow it exactly the way it's supposed to follow. And then anytime someone's not following that rule exactly, then that ends up being a reason to tell on them. There's a book that I've read before called This is Asperger's Syndrome, and there's a part in there where this family goes to a restaurant and it says on the sign, no shoes, no shirt, no service. So this kid with Asperger's was like, well, thank goodness I'm wearing shoes and a shirt. And they go and sit down. At the table next to them is a baby who's about 12 months old sitting in a high chair without shoes. Well, he's like, he's not wearing shoes, he can't be here, and so he gets mad and he tells the waitress, and the waitress just kind of blows it off. So then he calls for the manager. This kid's not wearing shoes and he's getting upset, and the family was asked to leave, and the kid's like, this is not fair. I had on shoes and a shirt, and this kid got to stay. Well, that's one of those rules that's very difficult. Like, at what point does the rule apply? A baby sitting in a high chair that's not walking yet probably doesn't have to wear shoes, but when do they? That's a very gray area, and it becomes very difficult for some of our kids.